Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening. It's great to see you all here, and of course to all of them following us at home, because we're live streaming the event again, as always in this series. My name is Daniel Fass. I am an associate professor in sociology here in Trinity, and I'm also the champion of the Identities and Transformation research team that leads this lecture series, Trinity and the Changing City. It's in fact the second year that we are running this, because building on the dimensions that were explored last year and the success of the series, there were so many aspects still left unexplored that we're going to explore this year. So last year we looked at housing, we looked at the linguistic diversity in Dublin, we looked at the migrants, just to name a few of the sessions. We looked at social class issues, and this year we expand on that and build on that to look tonight at the city on the move. We look at natural and cultural heritage in November. In December we look at racism in the city. We then move on in the new year about a session on religion, notionally called When Was Dublin Baptized and How Is It Faring Today? Then there will be a session on food sharing and sustainability within cities in March. And then in April, the end on education, class and inequality in Dublin. So quite a diverse range of topics, all linked under the umbrella of the changes that have occurred in a cosmopolitan city like Dublin, and where Trinity, which is at the heart of Dublin, features in all of this. The transformations, of course, that have been caused by the economic crash, austerity measures that followed on, recent improvements in aspects of the Irish economy. All this kind of range of topics is what we want to explore in the series. And as tonight, the way it works is we always have on the panel Trinity experts that speak on the topic, as well as external speakers and practitioners or representatives from the media, so that we have both an academic perspective but also non-academic perspective on the topics that we want to tackle. And also what we have done, just so in the interdisciplinary spirit of the whole series, and indeed the Identities and Transformation research theme, we have a chair assigned for each of who takes charge of each of these sessions. So tonight it's going to be my colleague Tom Walker from the School of English. So I hand over to him, and he will lead proceedings tonight to introduce all our speakers. I hope you all enjoy it. This, and indeed, please spread the word. I've distributed leaflets to all of you as you came in. Please alert others to it as well. If some of the forthcoming sessions are of interest, do come along. We're delighted that you're here tonight. And Tom, stage is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. So tonight's session is on the city on the move, and it's really thinking about the transport of Dublin, the infrastructure of Dublin, and how that's really profoundly shaped the experience of those who've lived in the city, going right back to the 18th century and moving into the present and indeed into the future, and thinking about how there's that's been a constant source of debate really around the city. And we're going to be looking in this interdisciplinary spirit at perspectives from history, from culture, but also from engineering and from geography. So it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening. Our first speaker, so what we'll do is we'll take our four speakers in turn. They're all going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll all come together and have a discussion, and we'll open it up for questions as well. So our first speaker tonight is Finola O'Kane Crimmins. She's a professor in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy at University College Dublin. Her research focuses on the design landscape history of Ireland and of the Atlantic world. Among her many publications, her first book, Landscape Design in 18th Century Ireland, and her 2013 book, Ireland and the Picturesque, Design, Landscape Painting and Tourism in Ireland, 1700 to 1830, were both awarded the J.B. Jackson Book Prize by the Foundation for Landscape Studies. Her current book project at the moment is about landscape and revolution in Ireland, France and in America, and it's my great pleasure to welcome her up to speak today. Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to find my PowerPoint.
slideshow.
Where is that now?
Too long from.
Too long. It's not slide sorter.
No, slideshow.
I can't see it.
It's at the top, along from view to.
Oh, got it. Sorry. Begin. Now I'm just going to turn down the lights a little bit.
4.
4. Yeah, there it goes. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here at the centre of Dublin to talk about essentially Dublin's landscape and how I think it has moved and shifted over the past 200 years. And some of what I'm going to talk about is also how Dublin's identity and structure has shifted over those 200 years as well. And I thought I'd start with one of my favourite paintings of Dublin, which is that of an Italian arriving into Dublin Bay and seeing on the left-hand side the kind of Dutch landscape of reclaimed polder dykes. And in the background, which is grey, is Leinster House. So the landscape that Dublin sits on is also really very man-made in a way that other Georgian cities are not. It has large areas of reclaimed land. And people at the time noticed this unusual structure that Dublin had. And this is one of my favourite quotations from somebody who visited Dublin in 1780, who wrote that it's necessary to remark that the eastern side of the city, contiguous to the sea, is almost entirely laid out in elegant streets for the residents of the gentry, and the western side, though more remote from the sea and consequently not so conveniently situated, is inhabited by merchants and mechanics. And this is an unusual structure for an 18th century city because of concerns about prevailing wind and the smell. And typically people live in the southwestern quarter of the city. And so Dublin swivelled in the 18th century because of the power of its two great families, the Gardners and here the Fitzwilliams, and essentially started to look to the sea and to look out towards the wider world and out into its absolutely wonderful bay. And this is a type of map which in a way commemorates that view of Dublin arriving into the bay. It's also, which I think is significant, the view of people arriving from England into Ireland. So that colonial identity has always affected how Ireland has been seen, because a lot of the most powerful people in Ireland were not necessarily here for very long, were not necessarily here at all. And so they viewed Dublin in this way, from their position and looking at it from there. This is Dublin's landscape. It has always had severe morphological constraints on aspects of its transportation, or that is really how you would frame it negatively. You can also frame it positively. It sits on a great bay, but the bay is also a block to its developing a proper ring road system, which modern planners and engineers are extremely fond of, and which many European cities such as Paris find very easy to develop because of their essential structure. So Dublin has this great bay, which it can address, but it also blocks it from developing that circular system. It also is profoundly east-facing, and the fact that it's never looking towards the setting sun has meant that it hasn't really developed the great kind of urban gestures for the setting sun, which cities like Lisbon have developed, where people can stroll in the evening and look at the sunset. Somewhere like Naples enjoys the setting sun because it looks west. Dublin looks east, and it's also arguable, therefore, that it's at certain morning lights or in certain times of the day that Dublin has tended to be painted best. I think it is a severe impediment to the planning of Dublin, that we have no great collection of Dublin's paintings, and that nobody could possibly really generally remember a great painting of Dublin in the way that it would be impossible as a Dubliner not to know the city's great books. So I do think that's a problem. Also, somewhere like Paris, you can go to the Musée Carnavalet, if anyone has been there, and you can literally see all the ways Paris has been visualised over time, and how Paris has been knocked and developed, and people have had different ideas about what Paris should be, and you can track those through the paintings. And this constant kind of perception of Dublin from the east, I think, also drives aspects of her identity. This is the leading image for the scenery of Ireland, written by and drawn, because text and image work very closely in the 18th century. You don't design a city in plan. You design a city the way what it might look like, and what would be the most beautiful way for it to look. And so our current preoccupation with development plans means that we don't necessarily remember why Dublin is where it is, which is that it's on a ford, on a great bay, between the mountains and the sea, and that there's a legacy of people actually analysing why it's there in the visual record, and also in trying to protect the visual beauty of Dublin by using the paintings to essentially kind of plot changes before they happen. And the fact that this has gone from a lot of our design traditions and certainly our methods for designing cities. Usually we only use vistas when we think that, such as in the Mater Hospital, when we think that a vista might be damaged by a certain development. Then we will maybe look at vistas, but we don't have a way of designing which requires people to keep a steady visual record of transformation. And I think Dublin did have that in the past, and we should really develop a collection of images that would be useful for people in planning the city. So this is Fisher's view of Dublin, and again it's significant that Dublin is kind of a hazy black mass in the background, and that you're arriving into the south wall and the pigeon house, and that's how you approach not only Dublin but Ireland, because if you're designing Dublin, because it's a capital city, you're not only designing this immediate local environment. A capital is the head on the body of Ireland, as it was described in the 18th century. And many of our large kind of infrastructural, certainly cultural infrastructures about national museums, national heritages, children travelling here for school trips, use Dublin is the head frequently. Whether it should be or not is another question. But Dublin is the head on that body, and it can't just develop singular local plans without considering that much larger identity and how it impacts on the rest of the country. Now I also want to talk, in the 18th century they would quarter a city to examine it, so there would be views from the four directions, and this is the southern view. This was actually the least fashionable view, because looking north in Dublin is always much more boring than looking south, because you've got the mountains. So this is Fisher's analysis of why this view is not interesting, and that it's actually how you place the spires that might make it interesting. This is the preferred view, and this is Arthur Young writing essentially about this view coming into Marino down the side of Lord Charlemont's villa. But here it was very significant, I think. He said it would be more perfect if the city was planted out. So there is also a tendency towards the 18th century to move away from urban landscape and to start to consider it, probably because of issues like health, that it has become less attractive, and therefore parts of it start to be planted out, and also planted out of the paintings. This is the view from the west of Dublin, a very positive and generally popular prospect point, which is from that other great infrastructural barrier in Dublin, which is that of the Phoenix Park. So I spoke already about the great barrier essentially of the bay, which stops the ring road, but also we've had this great royal deer park, which completely dominates the northwestern quarter of the city, and really makes it very difficult to plan that quarter in any way, which is both, again, a positive and a negative thing. Now, the Phoenix Park is also very interesting in terms of Dublin's identity, because it's also the centre of British military power in Ireland for an awfully long time. And you get these very strange drawings, like the plan of the manoeuvres. That's essentially the dance that the soldiers were doing across this landscape in 1775. So the Phoenix Park is also a great military landscape, and roads have always been a domain of military expertise and power. So roads and transportation in Ireland also contain this legacy of the military vision of Ireland, which has obviously changed dramatically over time. But the military have always had difficulties with making what they're up to picturesque. And I think this is one example of, towards that end of the 18th century, when Dublin is moving towards the 1798 rebellion, of Francis, when there's a big increase after the French Revolution of turning Dublin essentially into a massive barracks location. that you have to try and reframe these views and make them look a little bit more attractive by including cows. And this is another example where Samuel Brokaw is working very, very hard with his cows to try and distract attention from the massive lines of troops that are all lining up in front of Ors and Uachtaráin, and where it's not difficult to imagine just what they might shortly have to do at the time in question. So Dublin always has this tension, I think, between beautiful landscape and dangerous landscape, or military landscape, or strategic landscape. And roads for the military are always highly strategic. And so you get paintings of Dublin where it's very clearly the military men who are now overlooking Dublin. There's no gambling maids and people, nymphs in the River Liffey in this painting. And by this time, it's very clearly the military men who are in charge of Dublin's prospects. And these kind of maps, in the aftermath of that huge transformation of Ireland into one of the most militarised zones in Europe, which luckily we are now probably about as far away from as we could possibly be. But at that time, this ramping up of barracks, this is the kind of map which you can find in Kew, where the only buildings painted on the map are the military buildings. And where Dublin Bay has also changed, because you can actually land an army way out in Dublin Bay at low tide and march them into the city. So if you're the military, then the landscape of Dublin is quite different. And also the Phoenix Park, of course, is also very significant in this map, along with the topography of Dublin. And then this representation, we are very fortunate, but for the military it was always very dangerous as well, that so wild a district as Wicklow should be found so near the principal city in Ireland. It's almost as if you shifted a large part of the Scottish Highlands right into Lambeth and had it overlook London. And how that would have changed the form of London is interesting to imagine, but that's the character of Dublin. It has a very wild area right up against it. And this was problematic. So you get these kind of military roads driven through as picturesque routes, driven from Dublin far into Wicklow. And this is an engineer doing a very great drawing from the end of the 18th century about the military road and the ideal route for that military road out of Dublin, which was also, of course, also going to be a tourist road, because if you were doing a military road, you may as well do it so that tourists might like it as well. And these are the drawings by Alexander Taylor of that road, and there's the map of the military. I'm using this as an example of previous kind of road endeavours which were also accompanied by programmes of images, so that what you saw from the road and what the road did were kind of part and parcel of each other. And that the landscape, this is the Charles Abbott, who was the chief secretary of the time, out in Wicklow, plotting how to essentially take this landscape from the 1798 rebellion, where the rebels were still camped out, and basically turn it into an imperial picturesque, because the picturesque had really been taken over by Romanticism and by revolutionary men, and it was necessary as a counter-revolutionary measure to re-inhabit and retake those roads and reconquer them. So these kind of paintings, despite being very pretty in watercolours and in a nice exhibition on College Green, which the Lord Lieutenant also paid for, were also part of that programme to civilise Ireland and to connect it all with all these roads, and making the transportation extremely easy, yet for the citizens, but also primarily for the military, so they could move as quickly as possible around that landscape. So that's what I wanted to show you. I will just go back. That's what I wanted to talk about today. That Dublin has a long structure that has impacted on its transportation. It has impacted on the possible networks that can be made in that transportation. Some of them we like, some of them we don't like, some of them we might want to lose, some of them we might want to continue. And then it also has always used three-dimensional and two-dimensional images or places like the Phoenix Park to kind of plan out these infrastructural projects and make them attractive to as many people as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Dr. Catherine Milligan, Kathryn recently completed an IRC, an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellowship in the School of Art History and Cultural Policy at University College Dublin, before which she was the ESB Fellow at the ESB Centre for the Study of Irish Art at the National Gallery of Ireland, before which she completed her PhD here at Trinity. Her recent publications include research on Harry Clarke and Walter Osborne, and her study Days Long Dead, Painting Dublin 1886 to 1949 is forthcoming next year from Manchester University Press.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Tom, and for inviting me to come and speak this evening. I think my paper should follow on quite nicely. It's from Finola's. I feel like I need to apologise to the 19th century. There are several beautiful paintings of Dublin in the 19th century, but I'm going to dive right into the 1920s. But you can get the book next year to see some of the 19th century paintings. So I suppose where I'm coming from on this idea of transport and the city is how artists have depicted their movements through the city and the types of transport infrastructure. When we look at urban painting, really from the mid-19th century onwards, we see particularly trams and trains, modes of transport associated with industrialisation, with modernity, with modernisation of the city, as these spaces that artists become interested in because they're places where the people of the city come together, where you have upper class, lower class, middle class, all coming together to use, say, a tram network to move around the city. And I think to date this has been maybe slightly overlooked in Irish art history. So this evening I'm going to talk a little bit about Harry Kurnoff, whose painting you see here, and about Jack B. Yeats as well, who I think will be familiar to many of you. This is a very early painting by Kurnoff from 1926, showing a tram kind of bounding over one of the canal bridges, and you see in it that excitement of the new, of the modern city, filled with light, with commuters kind of going to and fro on it, and you really get that sense of excitement and potential in this mode of transport. I'm going to focus on the tram. I think it's something that we are starting to rediscover as the Lewis extends, and I think the comment you always hear is like, why did we ever take out the trams? And when you look at this body of paintings, you really see how culturally important they were. So just to give you a short kind of sense of how extensive the network was, the tram network was started to be kind of put in the 1870s with horse-drawn trams, and by the early 20th century you have 17 routes running around the city and slowly becoming electrified as well. We see the tram in lots of cultural forms, not least in Ulysses by James Joyce. And I wanted to, if I can find the page, read you just a little bit. The kind of central terminus for the tram network was Nelson's Pillar. And we see the pillar here in a woodcut by Harry Kurnoff, published in his 1951 book, Woodcuts, but probably made through the 1940s. We see a range of transport here, cars, buses, and trams as well. This is the little drawing that he would have made in preparation for making the woodcut. But I want to read you just a short passage from Ulysses that's titled In the Heart of the Hibernian Metropolis. Before Nelson's Pillar, trams slowed, shunted, changed trolley, started for Blackrock, Kingstown and Dalkey, Clonskeagh, Rathgar and Terranure, Palmerston Park and Upper Rathmines, Sandymount Green, Rathmines, Rigsend and Sandymount Tower, Harold's Cross. The Horse Dublin United Tramway Company's timekeeper bawled them off. Rathgar and Terranure, come on, Sandymount Green. Right and left, parallel, clanging, ringing, a double-decker and a single-deck moved from their railheads, swerved to the downline, glided parallel, start, Palmerston Park. So I think even just this short passage, you really get a sense of that kind of frenetic energy that you have around this tram network that's conveyed in some of these artworks. I think most people are familiar with this painting, Jack Yates' The Liffey Swim, which is in the National Gallery collection. And I wanted to start here because, again, when we look at this painting, we look at the swimmers, we look at the river. But I want to just draw your attention. I'm going to borrow your pointer, if I may. Hopefully it will work. Is there a... Yes. But if we look here, we have a tram, and another tram, and another tram. And if you look just here, we have someone presumably not going very far. You see the bicycle wheel just poking out of the crowd here. And so we see how this form of transport is made part of the infrastructure of the city through Yeats's painting. This, however, was a subject that he didn't just come to in 1923, and he would continue to go on. When we look back at the Yeats's sketchbooks, which are really one of the most fascinating parts of his oeuvre, these are small, pocket-sized, ring-bound sketchbooks that he would carry in his coat pocket as he walked through Dublin, noting down these little scenes, probably doing an initial sketch in pencil and then adding watercolour at a later date. We see here one example from the New York Public Library of the Dublin Bread Company Cafe on Dane Street. We have someone having her break here, but then again outside we see the tram and another form of transport, the horse and cart just beside her. And again here, a much earlier work, 1901, but prefiguring, I think, the Kernoff painting of this idea of the tram as it crosses the canal bridge from the still relatively new suburbs into the city centre. But when we come to the 1920s, we really see the idea of the tram and the space of the tram develop into something else in Yeats's painting. So we're going to look at two paintings from the same date. This one, the first, is from 1923, so the same year as The Liffey Swim, and it's called In the Tram. And we're travelling along, we think, as best we can, this greeny hedge here, the wall, perhaps down along the side of Phoenix Park on the Lupin tram, and we have these three women sitting in a carriage having a good old gossip. You know, they've got these great hats and their clothes, but just notice the distance then and this solitary passenger here. This, as I said at the start, this idea of a space where people are kind of mixing, or in this case, where some are mixing, some are isolated from each other. This painting is from the same year, and so you can see often we think about Yeats and his painting as developing over time, but these paintings show how actually it's more kind of working alongside each other, trying out new things as he goes along. This is called The Full Tram. I think it always reminds you of evenings that maybe a little bit like tonight when it's raining and the last thing you want to do is get onto a full Lewis carriage. You can always smell the wet coats. But again, what we have, this wonderful beam of golden light on the floor and the roof of the tram, drawing us down into this really crowded space. And again, we see the solitary figure here, watched by this woman who's just entering the trolley. And again, we get this idea of kind of surveillance in the painting. If we look here, the faces of these two men looking over at the woman here. And I think it's really interesting to think about this in relation to the date, 1923, we're just at the end of the War of Independence, the Civil War. And when we look back through the military witness statements of the Military of Bureau of Military History, we see that the trams played a really important role during the guerrilla warfare in Dublin. Often, you know, there's little tidbits that meetings or kind of almost kidnappings and that kind of thing happening on the tram. And Yeats kind of brings us into that, maybe that's some of that paranoia that might have pervaded Dublin at that time. But this, you know, as I say, continues to develop as his technique changes. This is a work from Harvard Museum of Arts. His works have ended up all over the place. And we have the Dublin newsboy, who we see here, boarding the tram. So he's coming in through the door of the tram with this suggestion of kind of Georgian buildings here and little dots of light. We could do a whole other talk on Dublin newsboys in Yeats's paintings. But this is quite a late example of this. Really fantastic the way that he's painted the face, and we again get that sense of motion and speed. But what I find really interesting with this work is how he's bringing us into the interior of the tram, just like he did with some of the other works. But we feel like we're sitting down and this boy is popping his head around to talk to us. It's very immediate. if any of you are feeling like you would like your own Yeats painting of a tram, now is your chance to get one. This is a work that's currently up for auction in Adams, but was included in a recent exhibition in the National Gallery, and it's called Crossing the Canal Bridge from the Tram. And the scale of the reproduction doesn't do justice to it. It's about this size, a really beautiful, small, detailed painting. And again, he's bringing us into the motion of the tram. If we look here at how the tilt of the window frame as it crosses over the bridge, looking out into the dark canal here in blue, some touches of white, the green banks, and then it doesn't quite come across, but we have the little lamps of the streetlights, and again, the evening rush of commuters. When we get to 1927, which these three final works date from, the Harvard one, the one I just showed, and this work here from the tram top, we see again the development and the transformation of Yeats's urban vision. He goes from being that kind of isolated figure in the interior to this figure sitting on top of the tram, surveying the city. He's made kind of that paranoia into something more powerful. And I suppose when we are here this evening to talk about transport in the city, we might think, well, why are these works important? Why do some paintings from the 1920s, what do they have to do with the development of transport today? Well, I think, and I hope you think, that these are very familiar to us. We've all sat in the crowded carriage. And when we look at art or literature descriptions of transport, we see that it affects our everyday journey through the city. What is a network without it being good for the people who use it? And Yeats gives us a real sense of how the tram network was used by people in Dublin through the 1920s. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katie. So our third speaker tonight is Federico Cugurullo, who is assistant professor here at Trinity in smart and sustainable urbanism in the Department of Geography. He is currently researching how artificial intelligence is impacting on urban governance and planning. He's done extensive research in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, where he's investigated the sustainability performance of supposedly environmental cities such as Masdar City in Abu Dhabi. And his work has been used by the United Nations and the United Kingdom's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to foresee future urban challenges and develop preventative policies. So I'll hand over to Reggie.
Thank you very much. Hello everybody, thank you for being here. It's a fantastic event. Thank you, Tom, for organizing it. Let me ask you a question, a very direct question. Would you use an autonomous car? And I'm asking, would you use, I'm not saying would you drive, because in this case you would not be driving. The car would drive itself, or more specifically, there would be an artificial intelligence, an AI, doing the job for you. And we're not talking about some kind of science fiction or a scenario set in a faraway future. Autonomous cars are currently being tested in a number of cities all around the world. London, Singapore, Hong Kong, San Francisco. Even very recently, Dublin experienced the trial of a self-driving vehicle in the Docklands. So not very far away from where we are
Sorry,
today.
you just need to use the mic. I don't think I can hear you at the back.
Can you hear me? No?
No.
No? Okay.
You just have to hold it.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, in Dublin, very recently, there was a trial of a self-driving bus. So autonomous cars can be literally around the corner.
This is unlikely, however, to be smooth transition. Perhaps you, like me, are a bit afraid of a car that drives itself. Perhaps you're thinking about what happened in Tempe, Arizona, last year, when a self-driving car, an Uber car, killed a woman who was crossing the roads in these built environments. And in fact, the literature, recent studies show that a lot of people, especially vulnerable road users, such as cyclists and pedestrians, are afraid of simply being around a self-driving car. So it might be that until car manufacturers like Tesla, for example, can effectively demonstrate that a self-driving car is at least as safe as a human-controlled one, this transition won't happen at all. So not a smooth transition. Or maybe it is actually going to be a very smooth transition, because there are factors in addition to the attitudes that we have as human beings towards self-driving cars, factors that matter in this context. So let's travel back in time. We cannot travel far away in the future, but we can think about history, like in the past. We've experienced in cities many transport revolutions. And I'm going to talk about, we can have a look at what happened in the past quickly and learned from it. So let's imagine that we're not in Dublin anymore, and I think it's going to be easy because we see a lot of amazing paintings from the past. So let's imagine that we can go back in time, but we're not in Dublin. We are in Paris in the 1700s, and we pick up a copy of the Tableau de Paris, which was a guide for Paris visitors and locals, written by Louis-Sébastien Mercier. So we're in Paris, 1781. We pick up a copy of the Tableau, and this is what we learn about Paris from the words of Louis-Sébastien. Mind the carriages, mind the stagecoaches. Here come the prince, behind 6 horses, at a gallop, as if he were in the open country. The threatening wheels of the overbearing rich drive rapidly, as ever, over stones stained with the blood of their unhappy victims. Quite impressive and scary. So what was happening back then is that stagecoaches had been introduced in European cities. And cities were not ready. It was a dangerous technology. And many people were being killed. And many people were worried and were protesting about it. But the point is that back then, the aristocracy really wanted stagecoaches. That's because stagecoaches were then very fashionable, they were very fast, it was exciting for a nobleman to ride one, and they just didn't care about what the demos, like the simple people, felt about this technology. So they imposed this dangerous transport technology on the population and into the city, regardless of people's feelings towards stagecoaches. But perhaps we don't need to go back in time to understand these controversial aspects of urban transport transitions. We can think about what's happening today with normal cars. Like we know for a fact that every year about 1,002,000 people die because of road traffic accidents. And that's the principal cause of death for children and young adults all over the world. And yet we use cars, we drive cars. Cars are everywhere in the city. So maybe the same dynamics, the same controversial dynamics will underpin the transition towards autonomous transports, which might be much smoother than we think. And to explore this phenomenon in more empirical details, I want to share with you some preliminary findings from a project that we're currently running in Trinity. It is called Surpass: How Shared Autonomous Cars Will Transform Cities. It is a 2-year project funded by the Irish Research Council, merging urban geography with computer science methodology. It is the first project of its kind. I am the PI and the urbanist of the project. I'm very lucky to be working with my colleague and friends from computer science, Professor Ivana Dusparik. We also have 2 amazing postdocs, which I want to thank, Dr. Ransford Achapong and Dr. Maxime Verial. And we're looking at how the city of the future will change the moment autonomous cars will be in play, will be part of the urban equation of transport. The first part of the project is looking at people's attitudes. So how do you feel about an autonomous car? Are you concerned about it? Would you drive one? And we managed to collect, as part of our first survey, about 1,200 responses. And we're very proud to say that this is the largest and most in-depth survey of its kind. So let's have a look at what people in Dublin feel about driverless autonomous cars. So as you can see from this table, many people have a plethora of concerns regarding self-driving cars. They are afraid about a self-driving car interacting and hitting cyclists, hitting pedestrians, or just a simple interaction between a driverless car and a manual car is a source of concern. People are also very worried about the system driving the car being hacked, or the system simply malfunctioning, like it happened in the case of Tempe, when the Uber car killed a woman. So there are a lot of very, very deep concerns regarding this technology. Yet, when you ask people, okay, you have these concerns, but ultimately, if autonomous cars were available, would you drive one? This is what we find out. Yes, most people say, despite these concerns, I would be happy to drive, to be on a driverless car, which is very interesting. I think it says a lot about, human nature and how, many factors shape our decisions, and this goes beyond safety. So that's the first part of the project. In the second part of the project, which is ongoing, we're basically running a computer simulation. We're using these sociological data to simulate how the city of the future will change in terms of traffic, the moment autonomous cars are in play, and how we can redesign the built environment to maximize the sustainability of the city. We don't have questions. We have a lot of questions. We don't have answers yet. It's an ongoing project, and that's also one of the main reasons why we're here today. This is an open question which concerns everybody. So would you drive? Would you use a driverless car? And what is your vision of the city of the future? I'm looking forward to sharing ideas with you in the next forthcoming discussion. Thank you very much.
So our fourth and final speaker is Brian Caulfield, who's an associate professor, again here at Trinity in the Department of Civil, Structural and Environmental engineering. Brian's research addresses issues such as the environmental impact of transport and methods to reduce the carbon impact of transport. Dr. Caulfield's research is also, Dr. Caulfield is also the former chair of the Irish Transportation Research Network and sits on the executive committee of the university's Research Transport Studies Group, as well as several committees at the Transportation Research Board in Washington, D.C. And Brian's going to speak to us today. Of course, yeah. Want the light on?
No, the light.
Okay, I've just done 5 hours of teaching today and I'm getting over a bit of vertigo, so I'm going to sit down, otherwise this could be a very interesting presentation.
Could you just turn on your mic and pull it forward too? Thank you.
Is it on?
You just have to press the green button.
There we go. Can you hear me?
I might just need to bring it forward a bit more. Sorry, it's just on the right of the back.
No problem.
Thank you.
So my kind of theory when it comes to teaching transport is that we have a space problem. We don't have a transport problem in this city or any city. It's something I teach all my students, basically because if we had or if we wanted motorways, if we all wanted to drive, we could build the motorways. The engineers can do that. We could build heavy rail systems that would carry people. It's a matter of kind of apportioning out this space and what we want this space to do. And my slides aren't as eloquent as the really nice slides that we saw from our colleagues from humanities. There are going to be some numbers, but there's also going to be some images as well. So what makes a city livable? So there's a number of cities that always come up at the top in terms of livability and somewhere that people want to be. So this first city here is Amsterdam, and here we have in the blue box is the modal split. And the modal split is basically what traffic engineers look at when they see a city to see whether or not it's sustainable. So in this one here in Amsterdam, you can see 20% of people drive on a daily basis to get to work, 17% public transport, about 30% of people walk, and about 32% of people cycle, which is expected. It's Amsterdam. The white box there comes from a data that we use in civil engineering called the Tomtom Congestion Index, and basically that shows that, say, in the evening peak, if you're driving by car, you're driving an extra 15 minutes above on what you should be. Copenhagen, pretty similar, 26% in private cars on their own, which is very small compared to what we have in Dublin. About 27% by public transport, 41% by bicycle, and this is the cheapest and most healthy and the cost-effective mode of transport, and that's clearly it's the one that we're pushing in the city. Congestion isn't that much of a problem in Copenhagen. In The Hague, this is another city that comes out as being quite sustainable. You can see that car traffic does increase in this city. It's a little bit more than in other cities, but you can see bicycle and walking are quite high, and the congestion as well is a little bit more than the previous two, but not as much. And then Dublin, 46% of people in our city drive to work, which is too high. 21% use public transport. 20% of people walk, and the walking figure here is very high, and it's something that we should be very proud of. There is no investment in walking. There is no walking policy that the Department of Transport has put out. And cycling is at 5% from a very low base a number of years ago, and that's the mode of transport that gets a lot of attention. It's the one that's growing. But you can see then in terms of congestion, people are spending an extra 26 minutes in the evening peak stuck in traffic. These are averages. Obviously, there are some people that it's taking longer. We have a congested public transport network. This is an image of the amount of buses we have in the city. I think it was mentioned in the bio for the talk about Bus Connects and Metrolink, and they're two projects that I've been kind of vocal about and promoting in the media. We have a congestion problem on our public transport network in the city. We don't. If everybody in the morning decided to leave their car at home, there isn't the capacity for us to use bus in our city at the moment. This is a website which I laughed when I heard it was launched. It's called peaktime.ie, and basically it's the dart telling you when you should take the dart. If you take the dart in these red zones here, you're likely to be standing, and you're likely to get beautiful paintings perhaps, but you're not likely to get a seat, or you're maybe not likely to get onto the dart itself as well. So it's one of the only cities in the world that I know this happens, and this is obviously a symptom that our city is congested, and the public transport offering, if it were increased, that the demand is there. And it's one of the things that I spoke recently at the National Transport Conference, and I said at the moment there is the political, well maybe not the political will, but there's definitely the people are behind to support in increased investment in public transport. The Citizens' Assembly came out and said that we should be investing in public transport 2 to 1 over private transport. There isn't a public transport project being constructed at the moment in this country. We've lots of plans. So this is what I mean by space. So that's a bus, that's the amount of people a bus will take, and that's how many cars a bus should be able to take out as well. The next slide, so this type of image has been done all around the world, and it shows how sustainable the space is. So these spaces and this type of road is a rarity in our city, and it's making the most out of these spaces. I feel it's the most important thing that we need to do. This is Bus Connects. So this is obviously outer city Bus Connects. It's got 2 car lanes in the middle, 2 bus lanes, 2 cycle lanes, 2 footpaths. It's got trees. Everybody is happy. But there are parts of the city where this isn't going to be the case. There's going to be parts of the city, and I think there's a really good example of citizen engagement that happened in Inchicore, where the people of Inchicore wanted to keep their trees. They wanted to have Bus Connects. They realised they live in a city. They realised this is something that's important. And engagement with the NTA had meant that they're basically getting rid of the car. And it, like someone asked me there recently that was this by design, that they were going out and they were going to chop down all the trees, and then the outcome of that was that the cars were gone. And I said, I don't think so. I don't think that was the case. But this is the biggest project. It's the project that you're all hearing about. It's the project that's not just the Dublin-based project. It's a project that's going to happen in Galway, Cork, Limerick, Waterford. Bus Connects is a fundamental rethinking of how we use our bus network in our city. As you saw at the start, we have bus congestion in our city. We don't have the space to just simply put on extra buses. That has been and gone. We need this Bus Connects project will give us 40% extra capacity with very minimal extra buses put on. But it's a debate as a city that we need to have, and it's a debate that's ongoing. I think next week the next version of Bus Connects is launched. It's the biggest civic engagement, it's the biggest public consultation outside of a referendum that's ever happened in the state. The amount of submissions, etc., has been phenomenal. People are engaged in it, and there is the political will for it, and generally mostly positive. This is another project that I'm quite passionate about. I tell Dublin City Council it's the extension of Front Square, down almost as far as the Central Bank. And this is a project that basically is the introduction of one of the only plazas that we will have in the city. It's the civic space we use when presidents we like come to talk to us. So it's a space that we really should be reclaiming back. And these are the 2 big decisions I feel the city is making at the moment. The metro is going to happen, barring an economic shock, I think, and it's perhaps less contentious compared to this project and the Bus Connects project. But you can see that the vista. There's a number of these different images that are out there. And this is another project that's going to planning again. So sometimes we get it wrong. This is an image of the quays, and this is an awful artist's impression, so there's some awful art as well, of the Liffey. And this is a motorway that they wanted to build across the Liffey that was going to go up through Christchurch, and it was going to go out towards Harold's Cross, and on the opposite side of the city go past Boom Bridge. And this was a motorway that was built or designed and planned by engineers, traffic engineers, back in the 60s, and thankfully we ran out of money and this never saw the light of day. So this is an example of a project that didn't happen. This is an example of a project that did happen. So this is an image of the tram tracks that were taken up. and more or less the reinstatement of the current Lewis system in front of college is more or less a carbon copy of what we've taken up. So that's kind of the bigger city thing. And transport, one of the things that people in Dublin City Council tell me about Trinity and our campus is that it is the roundabout in the middle of the city that they can't get into. But a colleague of mine, our head of department, Angus McNabola, told me about this image, and he sent it to me this morning, and I just think it's a nice way to finish in terms of transport in Trinity, and something that they tried to push on us but never happened. This is a 50-year-old front page from the Trinity News, and basically it says the front square sold to the corporation. What do they sell it for? Car parking. And the main thing, well, they didn't obviously sell it to car parking because you just walked through it, but the main question that the student that was being interviewed at the time was, and it was interviewing Dublin City Council, was that could the students park in Front Square as well? And it's a very interesting article, but it shows the sign of the times, and it shows that, in the city centre that transport comes into our front door. The Provost was the only neighbour that had a driveway onto the current new Lewis track. So we do have a lot to say in terms of transport in the city, and there's many academics in our university that do say that quite loudly, and that's kind of what I want to finish on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. So I'd like to ask three other speakers to come up to the front. I'll hopefully get this light turned off. No. No. Thank you. Just not. So if we just ask you, you really do need to speak into them. They're a bit sure. Yeah, they need to be green. Okay, so we've got quite a bit of time for questions. What I'm going to do is something we often do at the hub here, which is to take a couple of questions at a time and then to throw them over to the whole panel to discuss. I would also just ask that your questions are questions. Sometimes people do other things, but it would be very nice if people would ask actual questions. So, do we have any questions from the audience? So, at the back.
I'm Frank. Can everybody hear me? So I live in Damastown, which is far away on the end of the city, basically. So is there something planned to have a public transportation, because I'm not driving, to Dublin West, for example, or to the airport? Because at the moment, public transportation is not existing in this way. So I would have to go to city centre in order to get to Swords or to all of these different places. So is there something planned in the future? Because that is really vital.
Okay, that sounds like one for Brian, but we'll just take one more, the woman here, and then we'll come.
Thank you very much. The Martin ones were very good. But I have a question about how the future of autonomous vehicles and the future of public transport how each of you might see that interaction happening. Whether really we don't really need autonomous cars, we should just have lots and lots of public transport and bicycles, or whether you see the future with a lot of autonomous cars, as many of them are now, because they work more efficiently or effectively, they don't get in the way. So it's a question kind of both of you about yours.
Great, thank you. So perhaps we'll address those questions. So getting from Damastown to the airport and questions like that, and then this question of autonomous vehicles versus the development. So Brian.
Okay. Again, I'm Trinity, not the NTA, but I know, for example, on the west of the city there is a plan for a light rail system to go out there, but again, it's only at the planning stage.
But it's the west.
Pardon?
So it's the west, and at the moment for me, the commuting is nightmare. I am on the bus 3 hours a day. And this is kind of, in the morning 1 hour, and in the evening 1.5 to 2 hours, which is, I'm sorry, but in order to be able to live alone by myself, because not everybody can afford a room in the city center.
And that's an issue that our students are having as well, and it's something that, like, we have a project ongoing this year about students that are doing excessive commuting and how it's impacting on their studies. I would say look at the Bus Connect's website, and I assume that there's something in there for that part of the city. The whole city is getting a makeover. See, the thing is about you need proper density, you need real densification in terms of where people are living in order for public transport to become something that's viable. So, like not every part of the city will have a tram system, but that they should have a better bus system. And like, I would talk to your TD about it. That's what I would do.
Because it would be really great if we have at least a bus to the airport and one bus to the west side or something like this. It's like, because going to city center in order to go to the airport is for me.
Okay.
It's double the way.
And Federico, what about this question about the autonomous vehicles versus some of the other developments? Do we need autonomous vehicles?
That's a great question. There are different perspectives that we may take to approach the answer. And we tackled this very question as part of our second survey that is asking people, assuming that there are autonomous cars available and there are also buses and other forms of transports, what would you like to use and how? What is your ideal mode of employment? And people in Dublin have many different opinions because we have different needs, we have different attitudes to the way we navigate the city. And personally, I think that sharing is key, and if autonomous cars become an established mode of transport, this can only be sustainable the moment it is, first of all, shared and be coupled with public transport. And the good news is that this reflects what people from Dublin desire. The bad news is that I don't know if the city council would like to, see this ideal city implemented. It really depends on factors such as people attitudes, also the technology being available, and third, probably most importantly, if we go back to the example of the Baroque city and stagecoaches being imposed by politically powerful actors, it is really down to the politics of the city.
Brian, do you want to come in?
The non-politician answer is no. I don't think we need them. We will end up with congestion problems. And the autonomous electric car is still a car. A car is a car is a car. And a car will end up with the congestion problems we have. I do think they're a solution. I think that they're probably a better solution for rural areas where they don't have the capacity for high quality or high service public transport. And there is a desire there. I think that's where it is. But for the city council to put in autonomous vehicles across our city, we're going to have to put sensors into the roads. And should we be investing in that when we could be investing in things that we need a lot more than making a car easier to use?
Do we have any other questions? Gentlemen.
Just a question. So just a question about the autonomous cars. In your opinion, would it be easier as a transition to this new means of transport perhaps in the future to do it in a gradual sense? Or would it actually be perhaps make more sense or even be safer to do it more abruptly, in the sense that you would not perhaps want to have human drivers try to mix with AI, just have AI with AI all at once on the road? Be perhaps maybe coordinate better between themselves.
And any other questions? Was there one right at the back? Or this woman here with yellow sleeves.
So just a question really about cycling and incorporating that into our transport network. It's really a question for Brian in terms of how do you see that developing. because obviously we've an over-reliance on the private car, and I think to encourage cyclists to actually utilise the facilities, it has to be very safe infrastructure to get up to the levels of Copenhagen and Amsterdam. So is that part of the bus networks connects, or how do you think that we would incorporate that into our transport network, like proper, safe, segregated cycling facilities? Do you see that as something that will happen and something that I suppose is part of bus connects? Okay, so that's the how to kind of phase in or not the automated cars, and then this question about the roles, the kind of cycling in relation to bus connects. So I don't know who wants. Federico, do you want to take that?
That starts. Thanks for the question. I think it points towards a very important issue to remember, that these transitions today, and the same happened in the past, are geographically diverse. So we won't see the same phenomenon taking place in different cities at the same time and in the same way. So solutions, proposals, policies have to be diverse, because cities are incredibly diverse. When it comes to the issue of the penetration of autonomous cars as part of the urban equation, we must remember that in cities, we already have established formulas of urban transport, so we can't really change completely these formulas, and that autonomous cars, if they take over, would be gradual. I mean, we cannot imagine a situation in which from one day to another one there is a revolution. It's not going to happen, and it was not the same in the past with cars, never the case before with stagecoaches, probably it's not going to be the same. The exceptions are new cities. My field of expertise is urbanization and planning, and we live in Dublin, but there are also a plethora of new cities under construction all around the world, especially in developing countries, Africa, also in economically powerful countries like China, or in the Middle East, Abu Dhabi, and over there they are building new cities from scratch, with the idea of having AI systems running big dimensions of the city, not only transports but also energy, safety, and in this blank canvas context, then the takeover will be like 100% from day one AI based. But in Dublin, that's not going to be the case.
Great. And Brian, about the
investment, the transport budget that was just announced, cycling was hidden in tourism, and it was given €9 million. Bus Connects has a lot in there in terms of cycling. To get to the levels that Copenhagen have, and even Amsterdam and all of those other cities, it's a generational thing, I would say, that investment, and also education is a very important thing. And I think, like Trinity, I've been working with Martina Mullen, and Trinity is doing an awful lot to encourage people to cycle. And I've worked with Dublin City Council talking about how to get our students in from Dartry, from Trinity Hall, in safely into the campus. But what Dublin City Council will say to me and say to Trinity then is, where are they going to park their bikes? Where is the investment in parking for cyclists on campus? So it's a two-way kind of thing when it comes to that. But it really is in terms of investment, and education is key. And I think once we get rid of the private cars from the city centre, I think it will make it will result in a sea change in how safe the roads. It happened when we opened the port tunnel, when we got rid of the heavy goods vehicles. I think it will happen again when we get rid of more cars. Talk to your TV.
Great, so we've got a question right at the back.
I think the question of public transport, whether it's viable or not, would depend a lot on the amount of subsidy that it gets. And I believe that here it gets a lot less in other countries. And the other thing is, Federico raised the question of how many people here would use an autonomous car. And I'd like to see a show of hands.
Nice.
Okay, so how many people would use an autonomous car? You put your hands up if you would. I think that's about maybe just over half, I'd say.
Can I take notes for my
I'd like to kind of throw a question over to Kathryn and Finola. I find it interesting that I suppose the two more applied or talks both very much looked to the past. You both made very clear references to the past and the images of the past. So I suppose I was wondering how the other end of it, you two, thought about that, or thought, I suppose particularly Finola, thought about the way that Dublin had developed and the sense of a history of that, which you obviously have. Can that speak to these contemporary debates, or are they just, are there lessons to be learned? I mean, particularly since the idea of the shock of the new, and everyone in 18th century Paris, very worried about being run over.
Yeah. I would say, particularly when we look at the first half of the 20th century, is that Dublin was a city of cyclists. And most of the artists I look at, if they're not walking in the city, they're cycling. And so I think maybe there's a way there to reimagine what Dublin will be like as a city of cyclists from the way, not only artists of the past, but the way people got to work and how that was visualised. Maybe there's some space there for thinking about where we'll go in terms of cycling.
I was also thinking, particularly when other people were speaking about the impact of different disciplinary perspectives, and planning in Ireland has always been profoundly influenced by the English planning tradition, which came out of the Second World War, where you had a lot of cities that had been essentially bombed into small bits. Yeah. Which is why we get those awful road projects. It's basically that people who are trained in England come back over to Ireland and say, well, we learned how to do this in Birmingham and we're going to do it now in Dublin. So I think we're also dealing with the latent issues, and we are in an educational institution that are present in the separate educational bias of each discipline that's involved in creating the environment. So part of what I was saying about this obsession with the plan, I think, is also part of the problem, that we forget to map the experiential qualities of the city, and that if they could be built into design processes much earlier, then we could argue much more for the advantage of cycling over being stuck in a car in traffic, which anyone who has been for long periods in a car in traffic would easily commit to any other form of transport, but we don't make that implicit in the design process, and I think that's part of the problem.
I don't know if this is a question for tonight, but I'm from the north side. I'm very worried about all the houses and apartments that are going up on my side of the city, and to see the traffic in the morning and people trying to get to work. Does anybody actually go in and do a survey of how, if these people are all going into these apartments and these houses? Just around the corner from me now, have gone really, really higher than ever before. I'm just wondering, how are these people all going to get into work? Does anybody do a survey actually to see how it's going to work with the transport? Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, any other questions? If not, maybe, I imagine Brian might have an answer to that.
Yes, is the answer. Whether it's done right and it's actually adhered to by the planners and developers afterwards is debatable. I would say for a unit like that that's got above a certain threshold of dwellings and people in it, it has to do a traffic impact assessment on how these people are going to be able to travel around. It's something that we teach in civil engineering. And when they leave us, but you should be worried about it, and it is something that there isn't, as I said earlier, there isn't a public transport project that's currently been constructed in the city. Like, I live out by Dundrum, and all of the planning that's been predicated out there is based on the Green Line, and the Green Line was always meant to be upgraded to a metro system. That's not going to happen now. So all of this planning has happened based upon something that's not going to happen. So it is something you should be worried about. But there is an engineering, the engineers know what they're doing in terms of how to do it, but it's whether it's actually implemented in the end is really the issue.
Great. And the gentleman here.
Hi. So I suppose I have a question of a bit of a different nature. So it's more about a cultural thing, I suppose. So it actually struck me when you, Finola, in your lecture, you mentioned that the road network in Ireland was to a large extent designed with rapid movement of the armies in mind. Because I'm originally from Poland. I came here 3 years ago, and what has struck me here in Dublin is how hard it is to actually move around as a pedestrian, and I guess even using any form of transport, how hard it is to move around. because the road network doesn't seem to be created with movement in the mind. I would say that it's actually the other way around. And what I'm talking about is the issue of permeability. So essentially, I keep being surprised by the amount of fences and the amount of walls that actually block passages, even within the city center, and kind of without even speaking about places further away. And as actually work as a transport professional and transport planner, we do quite a lot of work in property development, and very often what we see is a problem, like how can you get to a site, like how can you get out from a site. And you see that, for example, you would have this bus stop, like even if it is around, like you can't really get there without walking a few hundred meters, because there's some wall which kind of blocks the passage. Quite often a wall is like in the middle of a road, effectively. And it appears, from my experience here at least, that kind of trying to open up cul-de-sacs and like trying to make city more permeable is something that is dreaded by everyone, because it hits so much objection. Like if like effectively, like whenever we would try to propose, like maybe to open up the street to enable access, it's like always met by kind of disbelief from our clients and kind of objection, like no, it's not going to work. I mean, whatever we propose to build, which involves opening up passages or opening up cul-de-sacs, it's going to be struck down in the planning process. So I guess my question is about like how much of it is a cultural thing, like kind of how can this be? I suppose.
I think it's a profoundly cultural thing. I mean, I don't think the Irish state really has ever violated anyone's property rights very much, and that has a long legacy. And no, we don't. We're not like the French Republic that basically will appropriate large things in the large areas of land in the national interest. And there are good and bad things about that. So part of Dublin's character is that no, we don't have a great glasses like circular ring road like they have in Amsterdam and in Vienna, where the medieval walls became. So we don't have that tradition of large appropriation of space by the state or by public bodies, and that is a severe problem for connectivity, because individual interests have to, in such instances, bow to the greater public good, and we're not actually very good at that.
But this is not actually a question of big roads. It's a question of permeability for pedestrians and cyclists.
No, but what you're talking about are people's back gardens or back walls or my little bit of space that no, I'm not going to. I'm not going to kind of either donate that, and nor will I necessarily let. We still have an old estate structure in Dublin. Which is a legacy from the Georgian city, and where the old owners of a lot of the estates are still intact. We're sitting in one, so it's not easy for people to give up the old habit of keeping hold of my property, and I think that's why even really tiny property transfers in Ireland can be highly contentious and traumatic for everyone involved.
We actually had an event as part of this series last year where the architect from the Grange Gorman development body was here, and they've opened up a route to walk from Stoneybatter through to kind of the King's Inns, and he said he thought that was the first time you'd been able to do that walk for, I reckon he thought about 300 years. Across the city. I suppose would anyone else on the panel like to speak to that issue of the kind of permeability of the city? Maybe this question of the law, property rights, and the kind of Irish attitude to the law. Does anyone?
The only thing I would say is if you walk through College Green at the moment, count how many times a pedestrian has to stop, count how many times a car has to stop, and you can see who's got priority in this city at the moment.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, last two questions. So this gentleman here and then the gentleman at the back. We'll take them both.
So just one question for Finola. I loved your observation about arriving in Dublin and arriving to the city from the east, and the setting sun or the rising sun. Thinking ahead, the landscape, the story into the future, how can they record artistically arriving in an airport, getting the air coach. You know, there's no romanticism or heroics about that. And there's a follow-up.
Well, Alain de Botton was the writer in residence in Stansted Airport, which I always thought was a very interesting idea.
Yeah. All of human life passes through the airports. Yeah. They are the hubs. They are the arrival points for everybody because we all use them so much. And then, not on that, if Metrolink goes ahead, going underground will solve our remove our need to hold on to tracts of land if we can buy the ground space below. We're heading that way. The only way to solve our problem is to dig deep and avoid expropriation.
And the gentleman right at the back.
What's the bigger advantages of a driverless car over the Tram system of different cars?
Okay.
It seems to be somewhat reckless, like a car without driver control.
Okay, so this question about kind of arriving in Dublin at the airport and also going underground, and then what's the advantage?
Can I speak to the first question?
Of course,
actually,
yeah.
Because I think part of your question is about aesthetics, is arriving somewhere, the beauty of a place. If you look at 19th century travel guides, Finola will hopefully have you up here, is the descriptions of people as they sail into Dublin. They say it's as beautiful as Naples. I, for one, love when you're flying in Dublin as the lights come on and you come past Howth and the Sugar Loaf and you see the bay. It's eminently picturesque. It's really beautiful. How will that be captured artistically? Photography, film, maybe painting. There's no shortage of artists who see beauty in undergrounds, in train systems. I think our artists of today are absolutely equipped to capture that in a way that will record it for the future.
No one would record the air coach over.
Well, they might. I mean, it just because something, I think that doesn't have to be beautiful. Sometimes things are gritty and ugly, and that's attractive to artists as well. I really don't think we need to worry that they won't be adequately visualized at all. Yeah.
But I do think there are other. I think like pollution has always been an issue about an underground system, and there are choices that Dublin isn't an extremely large city. Do we really need to go completely underground? And and what are we going to lose if we do that? Because often in London, I figure out exactly how long it would actually take to walk on the surface rather than going underground, and it's invariably far less because of the way the system works. So I do think we need to think about, I know the metro is eminently sensible in many contexts, but I think you can make a strong argument that the environment you're creating is not as good as that which exists above ground. And that it's not particularly healthy for people to spend a long time underneath the ground.
Brian, do you want to speak about the Metrolinks a bit more?
I think it takes, on the model, I think maybe 21 minutes underground to get from the Green to the airport. And it's only the one route. I think you said dig deep, and that's perhaps what they have to do for that link, but it's also digging deep in terms of our pockets. Is it worth the 4 or 5 billion that has been put out there? I would argue that perhaps it is, yes, and it's something that the north side of the city really needs.
And Federico, maybe what are some of the advantages of the automated cars?
Sure. I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit. Apologies. The question is going to be, what are the potential advantages of a driverless car? Because I think that a car is a technology. It doesn't come with a script with predefined benefits, advantages. It is how we use the technology. So there are potential advantages. And answering your question as an urban planner, urban designer, I'll say that if we use this technology through sharing services, so if we share autonomous cars, it has been estimated that a single driverless car can replace up to 10 normal cars and about 5 taxis. So imagine Dublin with way less taxis and cars. As an urban designer, you could reduce the space that we currently reserve for cars, such as parking spaces, for example. Imagine the city with 40% less parking spaces. Imagine the amazing thing that you could do with this surplus of space. Cycling lanes, gardens, potentially you could bring back agriculture inside the city. So the advantages are infinite, but they are potential. So there is no scripts. We are preparing and writing these scripts ourselves.
Okay. I think on that note, we'll end on that very, I think, hopeful note about the potential of transport for hopefully making us all move around Dublin a bit easier. So I'd like to thank our 4 speakers one more time. And thank you.